This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 24. Do banks really work for us?
Hello and welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie and Professor Steve Keen is with me, and today we look at the finance industry. Is it working for us, or is it working for itself? Now, many might look at the big wages in the City of London and say, well, you know, they may be people working for themselves, particularly when you compare how much they're earning with the average wage in the UK, which is about £26,500. And those working 40 hours a week on the minimum wage, they take home just £13,000 a year, a long way behind those fat cat salaries in the city. But we do need banks. I mean, they've been around since the days of ancient Greece, possibly before, and without them, we'd all be struggling to barter, which doesn't work out well, does it really? If you don't want a chicken for that paint job you've done in someone's front room. We need money in the middle, and hence we need banks. So, Steve, I mean, we need them, but are they working for us?
Well, the funny thing is that the problem lies in the very word you've used to describe what we do with money, intermediary. We think money intermediates between us exchanging commodities, and that really puts the spin on the exchange of physical goods rather than the exchange of little pieces of green paper. But in reality, what capitalism is really about is little pieces of green paper. The irrelevance for them, or the far less important thing, is the goods and services we're popping around. And this is where the problem lies in many ways, because it then comes down to, well, we get the goods and services exchange if it suits the monetary system, and if the monetary system is working properly and hasn't clogged itself up. But, of course, we've now found in very painful detail back in 2008 that both of those preconditions can collapse on us. And when that does, the capacity to exchange those goods and services goes out the window. So the real problem lies in the fact that money is not an intermediary. It's actually the main game. And, in fact, banks are not intermediaries themselves. They're money producers. And this is where the whole problem lies.
Well, right. And does that mean that the people who are involved in that process, the banks and people working in the financial industry, are the people who are, as you naturally would, looking after themselves? So they've got a different, they've got an ulterior motive against this idea of acting as the intermediary. And so, the financial system is looking after itself rather than looking after the wider community.
Well, it comes down to how they actually make a profit themselves, because the whole role is to make as much money as you can. And, I've forgotten who, I think it was Ted Wheelwright, the brilliant old progressive Australian political economist and brilliant historian of economic thought. He once said the golden rule is who dies with the most gold wins. Well, at the moment, I think we've got a pretty good idea who that's going to be. But that focus on just accumulation, as Marx himself said, accumulation is Moses and the prophets. That focus on accumulation is where the problems come from, because we have to then ask ourselves, well, if banks are actually money producers, how do they produce it? And the answer is they produce it by selling us debt. Now, that means they've got an innate desire to sell as much debt as they can possibly market our way. And that is why when you go to a bank, just like if you go to McDonald's, they ask you, would you like some fries with that? With a bank, they say, would you like a credit card with that? Or can we extend your loan limit, et cetera, et cetera? They're trying to sell you more debt because that's how they actually profit themselves. They then charge they make money on the volume as well as the markup. And this is what mainstream economists miss. It isn't just the markup, the difference between deposit rates and loan rates that their money's profit comes from. It's the volume that they generate. And that volume is what's given us the biggest debt bubble in history, and therefore the constipation the financial sector is now caught up in, which is why the goods and services economy is suffering what mainstream economists called secular stagnation. So there's a real dilemma there. But the other side of that dilemma is that as much as they produce too much debt, we actually want them to extend credit to people who don't have money and need it.
Yeah, and they're the people who they're not going to give the money to because they see them as being the biggest risk.
They're the entrepreneurs. Exactly right. The whole trouble is that it's very easy to produce more debt if you can convince the public that bricks and mortar are always a sure thing.
So doesn't
therefore they end up producing the money for housing speculation rather than for entrepreneurs.
Right. So does this mean then that we need more regulation? No. Well, I mean, but regulation, for example, saying, you know, what you lend for, you know, perhaps there needs to be.
Well, partly that you do, because, I mean, you can't regulate banks into good behaviour. You can hopefully penalise them out of bad behaviour, but trying to regulate into good stuff, you have to change the structure itself. So one thing I want to do, I think you and I have discussed this before, is I want to limit the amount of money that can be lent for asset purchases.
Yeah. I
want to put a maximum level based on the income that you can anticipate that asset will earn. And that means that in buying a house, I call this the pill. That used to be a fashionable word, and kids actually used it to stop getting pregnant. They used to do it these days. Not that I've done detailed research, but that was the property income limited leverage. So it set a maximum amount of money that could be lent against a property based on an estimate of its rental income.
Right.
And so for property like the one I'm in, for example, right now, rents for £18,000 a year, then the maximum amount anybody could get to buy it as a loan from a bank would be £180,000. Now, if you did that, I think you'd see a lot lower house prices in London, and you'd also force banks to look for another avenue to create debt and to make profit. But that's where the other side comes in. You want to give them a way of doing that actually isn't as you know, quite. They've got quite a good reason for being worried about the riskiness of lending to entrepreneurs, because most entrepreneurs will fail.
Right, you just said, when I said, you know, should we regulate banks more, you said no, because they'll always find a way around. And then you just given me an example of regulating a bank in terms of what they might do.
I mean, what I'm talking about is, regulations in terms of things like the Basel III, you know, trying to weight the proportion of assets that they hold. You know. Yeah. And of course, Basel II, and to quote one of my favourite people, Bill White, who was research director of the Bank of International Settlements, and the only person in a position of authority, you know, like an organisation like the BIS or the OECD or the IMF or the World Bank, the only person there to warn of the crisis before it came. Bill, we were having a talk about Basel III at an INET conference once, and Bill and I were sitting next to each other, and they were describing Basel III, and Bill went over to me and said, when Basel II came across my desk, my heart sank. In other words, he saw what they were trying to do is use regulations about the risk weighting of various assets to try to control bank lending. Of course, what they did was they gave 100% risk-free weighting effectively to housing. Well, that really helped, didn't it? Yeah. So that's what I'm getting. That was my initial reaction to no regulation. The idea about things like the pill is that sort of is beyond a regulation. It simply says you can't lend more than this amount of. It links the income of assets to the price of assets.
Right.
And that's what's been missed out by all the regulations that have been formed so far. Because these have been informed by a neoclassical vision of how the world operates, they actually believe that level of lending has no effect on asset prices. Now, you know, I mean, pass around the Kickapoo joy juice or the evil weed. That is so ridiculous. But that's the basis that's been behind all the regulations that have been done to boot. So it's not saying I'm against regulations. I'm against regulations informed by a defunct economic theory.
But how do we get loans that, that's a great example of how you make sure you don't have that asset bubble in housing. But how do you get loans that are for productive purposes? Because we still have the issue, don't we, that loans are going to go to who's going to pay the highest price for that loan rather than who's going to have the most productive use for the broader economy.
Yeah, well, this is where I recommend people take a look at I've worked by a guy called Andy McNally, a book called Detonator, D-E-B-T, Detonator, a very clever name. And Andy used to run a major boutique bank. He's now gone and formed a new company called Equitane. And Andy is someone who's realised over time by selling debt that, in fact, that's an incredibly non-creative way to create money. And what he's trying to do instead is to find a way that we can create government bank money not by creating debt, but by creating equity. And that actually chimes with something that I've been arguing for about more than half a decade now. Another side of the regulations I'd like to see, I'd like to make it possible to have banks to extend a loan to an entrepreneur, and rather than having a debt lean against the entrepreneur to have an equity stake in the business. They're fundamentally blending venture capital and existing banking. Right. And in that way, the whole idea of that case, that would give banks an incentive to lend for the capital gain they could get from the 1 in 5 or 6 entrepreneurs who actually succeeded.
That sounds like a lot more hard work than just lending the money out and then going after them when they don't pay.
Exactly. It's something that force banks to work. I mean, one of my mates back in Sydney is a guy who was a mining engineer who became a banker, advising banks on whether a particular mining project should go ahead or not. So that's a classic instance where you've got to really go and do your research. Do the people think is the ore of sufficient quality? What are the logistic costs in getting it from the hole in the ground to the ocean? What do you think about the management capability? Do they have good engineers, etc., etc.? That's a lot harder than saying, is there a property? Is there a house on this property? Right. Whereabouts is it? What's the growth rate of that particular suburb's house prices? And that would force bankers to actually work for the money they make.
Right, but I mean, there's nothing stopping banks doing that now, is there? It's just the fact that they've chosen to take the easy road.
There is, because it's the whole issue of loan versus equity. If you take a loan position in a major venture capitalist like Dyson, it might be somebody else who comes up with a vacuum cleaner that really sucks. So that's the dilemma they face. You might back the guy with good technology and somebody else comes along and wins. So in that case, the crapshoot side of being an entrepreneur can mean that if banks are actually trying to lend to that, they're going to lose money and they're going to lose, they're not going to get their capital back. And of course, the essential thing for a bank is to maintain positive equity. You and I, believe it or not, can operate for a while with negative equity. A lot of firms do all the time. But a bank simply can't do that. That's the definition of bankruptcy. So the danger is in lending to entrepreneurs, they'll expose themselves to that possibility. And that's why I say the way around it is that debt, when you lend £100 million to somebody, that's all you've got as a charge against them, £100 million. If you lend £100 million and it goes with an equity stake at, say, 50% of the business, then if the business succeeds, then your 50% goes from worth 100 million to 1,000 million, and you make up for the other ones that fail. So something that enables them to make money, because banks have to be profitable.
Right.
I'm highly critical of banks as they stand, but if they're not profitable, then goodbye capitalism.
To get banks to that stage, though, I mean, what has to change? Because, I mean, can't they just do that? Can't they make that decision, apart from the fact, as we say, it's hard work?
They can't right now. No, they can't right now because banks effectively, I don't believe it's possible. When banks need a banking license to operate, and the banking license, quite sensibly, is prescriptive about what they can do, the amount of capital they have to have, and so on. And it would also be, of course, when you get a banking license, what does the license do? It licenses you to create loans. Yep. It doesn't license you to create equity.
Right.
So you need to change that particular element of how a banking license is issued.
Now but doesn't this also create greater risk for those people who've got money stashed in those banks? So we've got this, this whole question about whether investment and commercial banks, for example, should be separated out because of, almost exactly that issue, that if you're making risky investments, you're going to hit the high street bank and that could hurt the poor.
Well, in fact, we think about this the wrong way around, but yes, that's a genuine issue. What we tend to think is, well, you put your deposit there and then your deposits are at risk. In fact, that's not the case at all, because the banks don't lend your deposits. They create the money by creating a loan. I'm saying that you create the money by creating an equity position. But what the trouble is that if you allow the institutions that create money by lending to entrepreneurs or even lending to businesses, whether they take an equity position or a loan position, if you mingle that with people putting their deposit accounts in a bank for safekeeping to use for transactions, then if anything goes wrong with the money creation process, that screws up the people who are just there for the transactional process, and they get sucked into the whole thing. So that's one of the best reasons to have the sort of system that the Japanese, I think, still have, and we used to have in the past as well, where there was a separate set of institutions, like in Japan it's the the post office bank, but a separate set of institutions which were just deposit takers.
Yeah.
And we had very strong limits. We used to call them building societies in Australia in that sense.
Yeah.
They operated with an account at another bank. So in fact, the reason they couldn't create money was that they would have an account at a bank and they would lend that account up to somebody else. And when they lent, that particular fund would decline. And that was insulated from being the credit creation system, where the banks would create money and create loans at the same time. And then if their money creation process stuffed up, then your deposits became at risk as well. So we need to have again, go back to this structural change, go back to the days we had different types of financial institutions with different responsibilities.
But is it also a question of scale? I mean, we had this belief, didn't we, before 2007, 2008, that the big banks, well, I'm sure you didn't, but we had the expression used a lot, the banks are too big to fail. And then we saw that, well, no, even big banks can fail. And in fact, it's because of this belief, I think, within themselves that they, that they were almost, risk adverse because of their scale.
And this is why, if you look at Richard Werner's work, Richard is a great champion of small banks. In fact, he's forming one in Southampton, or trying to form one down there. And he points all the time to the German banking system, which is much, much more smaller scale. The banks are much smaller and regionally distributed, and they actually end up knowing their local customers. So in that case, they can take a position in somebody because we don't think you're going to fail. We think we know your track record. You're highly likely to be successful. We'll provide you the funds. So in that sense, they do actually do what banks are supposed to do in theory and lend to entrepreneurs. So that's because they're small enough that they're actually on the ground and actually know who they're talking to. Yeah. Whereas you get to the scale of the banks like Commonwealth Bank in Australia and Lloyds over here and so on, all they can do is credit score. And if your credit score looks good, then they'll make you make you the loan to you, and it can be a 20-second process. Well, that's really helpful. All that works. It only works on asset-based lending. That's all you get out of it.
And then, of course, we've also got the issue, there's so many instruments that are developed by the finance industry to create more wealth, I guess, for those banks. And some of those are to do with trying to eliminate risk while creating extra revenue. Like, for example, making loans and selling securitization against those loans, which, of course, was the big problem we had in 2007 and 2008. Why do we allow that sort of thing still to go on?
Oh, yeah, again, it's to think of believing in a false theory. The argument was, when those things were created, that diversifies the risk and therefore reduces it. You can't diversify the risk that an oil well's going to blow up. It'll blow up or not, independent of the financial system. And what actually happened was, rather than diversifying those risks, it massively amplified them, because people were taking bets on whether a rig would blow up or not, and the bets were loaded completely on top of the original physical risk to create financial systemic risk. I really recommend people taking a look at The Wolf on Wall Street to see that explained beautifully by an analogy about people betting on the outcome of what's happening on a roulette table. And therefore, a small loss on a roulette table becomes enough to wipe the casino out, or everybody in the casino out later. So they should be banned. This is not regulation to say just get rid of it. Do not let people securitize away loans. You create a loan and you're a bank, it remains on your books. And that would have made a huge change to the willingness of banks to take this crap on. Of course, it turned out to be absolutely crap, as we all know.
So what we haven't talked about is how electronic trading has changed all of this as well. And, there's been, from time to time, we hear people talking about the idea of a Robin Hood tax to try and tax every transaction, not only because it's a great way of getting money out of, tax money out of banks, but also, hopefully, it's going to slow down the speed of trades and the speculation that is created by this electronic means. Is that a good idea? Is that part of the problem as well?
The speed of it? No, it certainly is a problem.
Yeah.
But it's again, it's one of the sense of progress as well. You'd actually like this stuff to be more rapid and less cumbersome than previous ways of making exchanges. But then what you do is, in terms of stock markets, you get the capacity for front running. So you get institutions that we all heard about high-frequency trading. I don't think people actually realise just how incredible these things are, but they're simply effectively front-running by using the speed of the technology. And I'll give you an idea of the speed of the technology. I was talking to somebody in this industry some time ago, and they mentioned that they were going across from optical fibre links to the exchanges to radio, and I didn't react. And when they realized I didn't react, one of the people who runs the organization replied, "The speed of light is faster in air than it is in glass." Now,
that's how important it is. Yeah, for sure.
That's how important, and that's how insane it is.
Right, and doesn't that mean then that it's quicker for you to lose the value of what it is you're trading against because you move to speculation rather than like we talked about giving loans and the idea that banks might have equity, have some skin in the game because then they're going to be more choosy about who they lend to, but also they're going to get the benefits from it. That's the idea of shares, of course, as well. But we lose because of the speed of it all. We lose the reality of what it is that we're actually bidding for.
Yeah, I mean, that's why Keynes did a wonderful job of satirizing the whole idea about liquidity in finance markets by saying that there's liquidity in finance markets, but there's not an actual production. So it's quite possible that a farmer will have shares in an oil company and shares in a wheat company and can flip from one to the other depending on whether he or she expects the prices to do. But that doesn't mean the wheat farmer himself can flip from producing wheat to producing oil. So we have a fetish for liquidity. And in fact, too much liquidity can be a problem. And Keynes was dead right about that again.
So how much of this is fixed then by just saying, well, okay, let's cut the scale of banks. Let's introduce some sort of legislation that says you can't get too big. And maybe, I think your other point was that maybe we also need to look at the function of those banks as well. So we start to issue different types of licenses. So you can't be all things to all people.
Yeah, and also making an emerging venture capital, so banks do have a profitable business model, and then, as you say, they're breaking it down and having a more diversified eco-structure of banks than the monolithic stuff that the mainstream economics always ends up promoting monolithic structures over diversified ones. We need diversification in finance, just like we need it in actual economies.
Right. Will that happen?
What will it take? It takes a financial crisis. It takes the system falling over and then remaining falling over and probably dipping back into failure once more. The 1930s, the major advantage the 1930s had over our period now is that rather than what the now departed President Obama did of rescuing the banks, what happened under Roosevelt was the banks were investigated when they had a bank holiday, and they were basically massive numbers of them were shut down, deposits were allocated to other banks, and there was a clean out of the system of a fairly dramatic scale. Of course, the Second World War came along in the aftermath, and very much caused by the Great Depression when you look at the politics of and the economics of the whole process. And in that situation, bankers were completely cowed by the beginning of the post-war period, and we had bankers providing working capital for corporations. That was the fundamental focus they had. I don't want to go through a set of cataclysms like that again, but we probably will have to before we actually end up reforming banking.
Yeah, maybe it is the only way. Good talk, Steve. We'll catch you again soon.
Okay, Matt.
Okay, and look, next time, talking about the impending financial crash, what do you do to protect yourself against it? I don't know how many times I've got an email telling me I should be buying gold. Is that part of the answer? We'll talk to Steve Keen next time on the Debunking Economics podcast. You can find us, of course, at debunkingeconomics.com. I'm Phil Dobbie. See you then.